alongside broader changes in British politics and popular culture, was indicative of an emerging, assertive black Britishness. While by no means endorsed and validated by all, whether that be minority or majority communities, this positioning highlighted the fallacy of the culture clash thesis, once purported by politicians, the media, and let's not forget some academics. The legacy of such developments is clear, as despite continuing to augment a variety of racialised exclusions, sport has become a prominent sphere in which minority ethnic young people seek to assert a sense of Britishness, as my own work on British Asian footballers has shown. So Malik was broadly correct here. This was something I reflected on recently as I sat at Wembley Stadium last month for the England versus Ireland men's international football match and observed the multicultural mix, not only wearing the three lions, but cheering them on too. However, my argument throughout this paper, and my work in general, is that support for these stars in a sporting context was and remains a long way from signifying the wider social inclusion of their ethnic and racial communities. Furthermore, despite Malik's reflections on black Britons in the 1990s, the sight of British Asians and/or British Muslims representing Britain in elite sport was still then a long way off. Yet, over the last decade, such a scenario has very gradually become a less remarkable occurrence. In the rest of this paper, I'm going to talk about two particular British sports stars. Both are Olympic medal winners and both are Muslims. The boxer Amir Khan and the athlete Mo Farah. The work on Khan is development of work I've already carried out, and the work on Farah is very much an emerging project. I'm arguing that an analysis of these individuals helps us to explore and understand some significant changes to the relationship between sport, race, multiculturalism and Britishness in the last decade. Primarily, they allow us to appreciate how sport embodies a more nuanced and complex relationship between popular and political manifestations of Britishness, and how sport can be harnessed to endorse particular discourses around identity and belonging. As Mary MacDonald and Susan Burrell suggest, focusing on particular sporting celebrities provides an insightful way of examining the intricate and fluctuating character of power relations and patterns of social inequality in contemporary society. Moreover, as Martha Bolignani argues, celebrity, quote, is produced, consumed and interpreted in specific cultural contexts. As such, the celebrity individual cannot be examined in isolation, and again to quote Bolignani, there are certain qualities that permit for him or her to emerge in such magnitude at a particular historical moment. Sport stars, I think, are critical here. They are not just prominent and popular, they are also seemingly transparent, apolitical, and indicative of neoliberal ideology around hard work, individualism, and meritocracy. Yet in actual fact, constructions and representations of the minority ethnic sports star at any given time are, I contend, just as much those of the social, cultural, and political epoch in which they exist. In this regard, I want to propose that the dominant narratives told about Khan and Farah are not simply a case of personal biography or a tale of sport itself. Instead, they speak to the nuances and complexities of Asianness, blackness, Islam, Britishness, race, nation, and multiculture in 21st century Britain. So there are three central arguments to this paper. First, the particular minority ethnic sporting figures are selected as role models due to their capacity to endorse, whether consciously or through their external representation, specific articulations of Britishness that emphasise national pride and reinforce dominant political agendas, yet underplay certain aspects of cultural difference and experiences of discrimination. Secondly, the dominant elevation of these stars often involves the simultaneous pejorative construction of particular other members of their ethno-religious communities. And thirdly, the inclusion of minority ethnic sports stars is fragile and contingent. Their successes and identifications with Britishness do not prevent experiences of discrimination and exclusion, either for them or their wider communities. Okay, so Khan. Having arrived on the scene as a virtually unknown fighter, Khan, a second-generation British Pakistani Muslim from Bolton, won the lightweight boxing silver medal at the 2004 Summer Olympic Games at the tender age of 17. His rise to fame was arguably unremarkable for a sports star, an audience with the Queen, appearing on BBC's Superstar show and lending his name to a Bolton kebab shop. However, what was especially significant about Khan was his widespread adoption and appropriation for political purposes, and the way that he was subsequently represented by politicians and the media. In this regard, the considerable prominence attached to Khan must be understood as a product of a particular socio-political climate, a climate in which his publicly performed embodiment of a specific British Muslim identity was perceived to endorse hegemonic discourses around multiculturalism, citizenship, community cohesion, and the so-called war on terror under Blair's Labour government. Khan's proclamations and stylistic sensibilities and the displays of fandom he generated were extremely significant. They symbolised the hybrid diasporic identities of a generation of young British Asians, fusing elements of subcontinental, global and local cultures in their identities. At the time of his Olympic triumph, Khan spoke frequently of feeling British, but he was also openly proud of his Pakistani heritage and his Islamic faith. His band of supporters, friends and relatives, known as Khan's Army, combined England football shirts and Pakistan cricket jerseys, while chants of Allahu Akbar were juxtaposed alongside the now famous Union flag waistcoat worn by his father Shah. Indeed, in 2004, Baroness Amos, or Lady Amos as she was at the time, was drawn to state that, quote, "It depresses me that people still give credit to the TEBIT test, not least because it's an incredibly un-British test to take. Un-British because it can't get past the colour of someone's skin. Instead, she proposed Amir's boxing test, based around Khan's explanation that I'm Asian, but I'm British. I was born here, I went to school here, all my mates are British, and I'm proud to represent my country." A more critical reading of political commentaries and media texts around Khan uncovers how they actually reproduced the rhetoric inherent to New Labour's policies on multiculturalism, community cohesion, and the so-called war on terror. Discourses about Khan reproduced an assimilationist framework of race relations and purported the related suggestion that there is a desired or normative model of national identity and citizenship to which all minority ethnic groups should conform. So, Paul King, the boxing development manager from Liverpool City Council, but all of a sudden, people could see somebody who really was from a different religion and a different area of the country. Bolton's too far from Liverpool. Who really lived like the rest of us, and you can think of the normative us standpoint, and spoke like the rest of us, and conducted himself in an exemplary way. A much-cited Bolton resident who was cited in lots of newspapers, and I have to resist putting on a Peter Kay accent here. So when you look at him on the television, you see Pakistan, But when he opens his mouth, you hear Bolton. And that's good enough for us. We have claimed him. He's definitely ours. And in a clear embodiment of what Anne-Marie Fortier talks about, the politics of pride, Sue Mossop in The Telegraph spoke about there is a refreshing joy about the Bolton Pakistani, proud to wear the British vest. He is rightly proud to be Asian, but he's also so clearly British in his sense of identity, and that can do nothing but good, said his former head teacher. And there you see the Sun. I'm not sure how clear that is, but the Sun was saying this was after his first professional fight, which was 2 weeks after the 7th of July London transport bombings. The Sun today salutes boxer Amir Khan, not for his fantastic victory on Saturday night, but because he has the guts to say he's a Muslim who is proud to be British. In the wake of both the urban unrest in northern England in 2001 and the 7th of July 2005 London transport bombings, Khan's first pro-fight was 2 weeks after the latter. The government and associated agencies, such as the Commission for Racial Equality, proposed that these incidents were fundamentally the result of a lack of ethnic integration. Specifically, blame was apportioned for the so-called parallel lives experienced by white and British Asian citizens in areas such as education, employment and housing. British Asian communities took the brunt of the criticism, with a commitment to traditional culture and values perceived as contributing to their alienation and preventing them from participating fully in the wider social, economic and political spheres of British society. British Muslims in particular were encouraged by politicians and community leaders to become more involved in the mainstream British polity. Provocation by far-right parties and police inaction over racial harassment, together with the repercussions of government foreign policy, were completely overlooked or denied. More generally, the rhetoric of multiculturalism came under attack from New Labour and the CRE, based on the belief that civic celebrations of difference had been at the expense of identifying commonalities between different ethnic groups. Minorities' traditions, values and sense of identity were systematically marginalised within the public sphere. Attempts were made to replace them with state-regulated, appropriate core values which were believed to be the central tenets of modern British citizenship. As a 2001 Cantor report stated, a meaningful concept of citizenship needs establishing and championing, which recognises the contribution of all cultures to this nation's development throughout its history, but establishes a clear primary loyalty to this nation. In such a context, Khan's proclamations around Britishness, ethnic integration and fighting Islamic terrorism. Crucially, he never spoke, at least publicly, about the state terrorism undertaken by the British government towards global Muslim populations, were lapped up by the media. It is these articulations that permitted his simultaneous public identifications as Pakistani and Muslim. Put simply, these identities and values were not seen as problematic or threatening, so long as they could be marginalised or overshadowed by his Britishness, and exhibited within the dominant discourse around what a good Muslim should be and do. Okay, so bringing things up to date with Mo. Much has been made of the significance of the London Olympic and Paralympic Bid Committee's decision to centralise the city's ethnic and cultural diversity in their attempt to win the Games. This emphasis remained foremost in the promotional rhetoric espoused by local and national government, sporting performers and agencies, as well as the mass media in the lead up to the Games themselves. The extent to which this predicted multiculture would actually be present within the Games, and to which London's minority ethnic communities would benefit from this sporting behemoth, represented important questions to critical sociologists of sport. In a chapter I wrote before the Games, I asked, could London 2012 be a case of Olympic diversity, or will it simply be an Olympics in a diverse city? In addition, writing in 2011, Michael Silk posed the following question. He asked, will the other be included as legitimate multicultural racialised subjects, or will that inclusion be contingent? Difference might be allowed, but will it only be allowed in bounded ways? Accordingly, I want to argue that there are two important rejoinders to the dominant discourse that British sport, and by association, the London Olympic and Paralympic Games, were truly diverse and inclusive entities. First, I want to shed light very briefly on the staffing and organisation of London 2012, as well as the composition of Team GB in recent Olympics. Second, I want to discuss the so-called plastic bricks controversy initiated by the Daily Mail newspaper. Both are critical, I want to argue, for explaining the way Farrow was positioned and represented during London 2012. From a broad brushstrokes point of view, London's diverse and often sizable minority ethnic communities were poorly represented at elite levels of the agencies organising the London Olympics. The Olympic Delivery Authority, the LOCOG Board, the LOCOG Senior Team, and the British Olympic Association Board. And yet, minority ethnic employees were far more likely to be employed at lower levels, via agencies, and in temporary positions. Unlike a number of media commentators, my own observations from attending the Games suggested that the Games makers' volunteers were likewise unrepresentative of the ethnic diversity of the 5 host boroughs. Indeed, they seem to reflect what my colleague Mark Perryman called Home Counties 2012, rather than London 2012. In my experience at the Games, minority ethnic employees were most likely to be found in poorly paid and short-term contract, security and hospitality positions. In terms of participation, at the Beijing Olympics in 2008, of the 77 Team GB medals, 52 were won in just 3 sports: rowing, cycling and sailing, or the sitting down sports, I think the Australians. The vast majority of participants in these sports continue to come from privileged backgrounds and have benefited from the support structures of public school and or university systems. As such, they remain almost exclusively white sports, and there were no minority ethnic medalists, British medalists, in these pursuits in 2008. A recent British Future report suggests that the picture changed in 2012, in that a significant number of British medalists had parents from and or were born overseas. Yet, when one accounts for the ethnicities and class backgrounds of many of these sports people, I believe that the team demographic is still largely unrepresentative of multicultural Britain and serves to highlight the exclusions faced by many of Britain's minority ethnic communities in elite sport. Arguably the most significant single contextual issue of any current analysis of Mo Farah and minority ethnic British Olympians more broadly was the insinuations made by the Daily Mail, primarily columnists Martin Samuel, Neil Wilson and Jonathan McAvoy, about the notion of the so-called plastic bricks. In 2011, reflecting the prejudiced ethos habitually found on the front pages of his publication, Samuel spoke out against Team GB's plans to employ the broad selection criteria available to international Olympic committees in choosing their teams. Seemingly oblivious to the realities and trajectories of multicultural Britain and the diverse makeup of many of its teams in other sports, Samuel wrote, quote, "We're going to cheat. Not literally, obviously, that would be wrong. Team G's cheating is a more convenient manipulation of the rules, coming together with our colonial past to create the option of securing the best of America's cast-offs plus the odd Caribbean ringer. Participants were cited from a number of sports for athletes Shana Cox, Tiffany Ofili Porter, Michael Bingham, Julian Reed, Shara Proctor and Yamil Aldama seemed to provoke most venom from the paper. Their crime, in the eyes of the Daily Mail, was to have changed their sporting allegiance to the UK. Most of these athletes had British passports, residency rights and or British parents, yet the fact that they had lived overseas and or competed previously for other nations rankled the journalists. They were labelled waifs and strays and exotic additions, whilst it was claimed there is more than a small degree of expediency in the decision making. The athletes were accused variously of using Britain as a flag of convenience, stealing the records of British athletes, and narrow-eyed resourcefulness. With no apparent irony and a hefty dose of historical amnesia, the paper stated that, quote, the wealthiest British sports will become little more than colonialist enterprises. The Mail claimed to be concerned with issues of sporting fairness and the rules of competition. Yet, as Emma Bolton and Joseph Maguire argue, quote, the plastic Brit narrative can thus be read as an insight into right-wing perceptions about Britain and Britishness, and underscored by an anti-multiculturalism that struggles to celebrate dual nationals as truly one of us. Correct, but I think our critique needs to go even further. Despite the fact that some white athletes were included in the original plastic Brits narrative, including the Belgian-born Bradley Wiggins, a look at one of the main spreads used by the paper shows that their stance was unequivocally about race and, curiously, seems also gendered. Apropos their usual outlook, the paper was clearly purporting that particular types of migrants are more welcome than others, and it is evident which ones are which. There were also more subtle, yet equally insidious undertones. The so-called plastic Brits were placed firmly within the Daily Mail's broader racist, anti-immigration and anti-asylum rhetoric against what they habitually labelled scroungers and benefit cheats, through the insinuation that these athletes were benefiting financially from funding from UK sport without yet giving anything back. As Bolton and Maguire point out, before the Games, the Daily Mail was unsure how and where Mo Farah should fit into this discourse. Some writers pointed to his Somali birth and upbringing, plus his residence in Portland, Oregon. Others responded that he was okay. He could be one of us, in the national club, because he had not come to Britain for sporting glory or cash, and that he was a recipient of British culture and education. In the rest of this paper, I want to show the various ways in which, after his double gold medal success at the 2012 Olympic Games, that Farah was situated by politicians and the mass media. And this really is emerging research, but I think there's four themes which jump out. So the first theme of Farah as role model, and you can see the extent to which his contributions arguably overstate the case. So Amit Roy, writing in the Eastern Eye newspaper, said, without setting out to be a positive role model, he has become one. The manner in which he has been embraced by the British probably convinced many a young would-be militant that perhaps there is a place for Muslims in this country. Kahal Milmo in Independent. Farah also represents a new kind of national hero who came to London as an asylum seeker and worked his way up through the state school system. Not actually correct, the asylum seeker part. The skinny kid who arrived in Britain unable to speak English has the ear and the attention of the powerful. Then there's the theme about Farah's success shows that Britain is an inclusive place. Matthew Said in the Times. The power of the moment was not merely that Mo Farah was being embraced by Brits up and down the country, it was something infinitely more important. It was that his colour was irrelevant, so irrelevant that it didn't cross a single mind or trouble a single soul. The Mirror telling us this win for a son of Mogadishu was a victory for our oft-maligned multicultural society. Alan White, the New Statesman. Whatever we think, at some point, this country took a misfit and turned him into a national hero. So a sense of a celebration of Britishness beyond the individual and what Britain has done for this individual. Again, a return to this notion of the politics of pride, which Anne-Marie Fortier talks about. Boris Johnson recalling when he first met Mo Farah some years before. He did not speak a word of English, but here he was, a proud Londoner and a proud Briton, suffused with joy after winning in front of his home crowd. And Jane Moore in The Sun, let's hope that moving forward, the inspiring story of Mo Farah teaches us all that whatever our ethnic background, a pride in Britain can be our uniting force. And then Lindsay Johns. Naturally, the sight of Mo Farah draped in the Union Jack after his 2 victories, a symbolic gesture telling of an ardent desire to integrate both as an immigrant and as a Muslim, was majestic, deeply poignant, and hopefully far-reaching in its poignancy. And by way of a final theme, the way in which constructions, and there's 2 minutes to put on here, the way in which constructions of Farah are used to make pejorative assertions around other British Muslim communities, and particularly British Somali communities. So Jane Moore in The Sun went to town comparing Farah to Iftikhar and Fazana Ahmed, the couple who were in prison last year, convicted of killing their daughter. Despite living here for nearly 30 years now, Fazana still barely speaks a word of English. This, together with the couple's obvious disrespect, some might say loathing, for the country that welcomed them with open arms, makes them the complete antithesis of Mo et al. But, encouragingly, critical standpoints did emerge. Writing in the Times, Anushka Astana argued, quote, "We should be a little sceptical about this outbreak of multicultural goodwill, of this collective back-patting about how racial barriers are being broken down in Britain. I fear we may still be in the realm of, you're different, Mo, from other Somalis." Another key question, and one I've thought about for a long time, without ever quite establishing an answer, was posed by Amit Roy again in Eastern Eye. He said, somewhere along the way, Mohammed became Mo. Would the crowd have shouted, "Come on, Mohammed"? As Anne-Marie Fortier argues, the media subjects stars such as Khan and Farah to a double process of what she calls de- and re-racialisation. In other words, quote, the way they were taken up by the press was as racialised subjects, yet significantly, their dark skins were peeled off in the process of making them British. So, to conclude, at the end of the Olympic Games, the Sun newspaper claimed that the far right are wasting their time. They have lost. A London Evening Standard headline proclaimed that Mo Farah has sent a message of hope to all migrants. At the time, it seemed that they might, just might, have held an inkling of truth. But history tells us that the inclusion of minority ethnic sports stars is fragile and contingent. Their successes and identifications with Britishness do not prevent experiences of discrimination and exclusion, either for them or for their wider communities. It happened in France, most famously, with the repercussions of the multicultural 1998 Men's World Cup football triumph diminishing in the face of increased support for Le Pen's Front National. It occurred with Amir Khan, who since turning professional in 2005 has spoken about the racism he has experienced within British boxing, often citing the abuse he has received when watching his younger brother Hariri box in Liverpool. Farah has spoken about the trouble he has with airport security when travelling internationally due to his Mogadishu birthplace. He was also subjected to a backlash from the English Defence League after donating money from a TV game show, ITV's The Cube, to his own foundation and to children in Somalia. In May 2013, in local elections across England, UKIP won over 140 seats and averaged 25% of the vote in the wards where it was standing. Prominent EDL activity and rising Islamophobia can also be noted over the last month in the wake of the killing of Soldier Lee Rigby in Woolwich, attacks on mosques in Essex and Kent, and suspected racially motivated arsons at a mosque in Barnet and an Islamic school in Chislehurst. As the anti-racist activist David Renton writes of Mo Farah's success in a very recent chapter, quote, "This was one of those incidents when a common sense anti-racism becomes almost dominant. The challenge, however, is to convert the kind of enthusiasm for a multicultural Britain this has inspired into the energy campaigning requires to oppose the racism that continues to affect so many lives, against ethnic profiling by police officers, against deportations, against racial bias in sentencing." A recent report by the British Future think tank argues that young people are thinking less about race and we are moving towards a more tolerant society. Sundar Katwala argues that, quote, "It is fascinating that the British public fell in love with Jessica Ennis this Olympic year without ever quite sorting out what her ethnicity is." Drawing on research by the Migration Observatory at Oxford University examining press coverage of Ennis and Farah, the report notes, quote, "Notably explicit racial or ethnic terms were quite rare in these sets of articles relative to other sorts of identity terms," end quote, with Britishness emerging as a popular descriptive signifier. As I hope I have argued here, unfortunately, it is not quite as simple as dominant discourses of colourblindness or post-racialism would like us to believe. Progressive developments have undoubtedly occurred over the last quarter century, but the wider ramifications of multicultural sporting successes are more conditional, ephemeral, and limited than is widely suggested. Sport offers us a glimpse of what a multicultural Britain and Britishness might look like, but it also reminds us of how far we still need to travel.